you so much, Vanessa, and welcome to everyone who is joining us today. We're very pleased to be able to present the toolkit which we developed on religious inclusion in research. And, we have to say that I think this project in general with all the toolkits has been really wonderful to see. We've benefited from reviewing the other toolkits that have already been done and think they're a really wonderful resource for researchers to help guide them towards developing more inclusive practices, based on a number of different kinds of equity issues. So we're pleased to be part of the project and thankful to Vanessa for her support along the way. So we're just going to share with you a bit of a walkthrough of this document. And so the toolkit that we developed provides some general principles, practices, and questions to consider when working with religious communities, particularly those representing marginalized groups. So while some of the examples in the toolkit refer to specific ethno-racial religious communities, the focus isn't intended just to examine the specificities of religious traditions. It's more of a broad-based overview of different, ways to make your research practices more inclusive in a broader way, but we do use some specific examples to contextualize that. And the information provided in the toolkit is really a starting point for researchers to begin thinking about how to make their research methods and practices more inclusive for religiously identified individuals and groups, and also to become aware of some of the ethical considerations and concerns when conducting research with these communities. We also want to highlight that religious inclusion in research doesn't only involve practices that researchers should consider when working with religious identified groups, it also extends to working with research assistants, team members, and collaborators that might identify as being part of a religious group and/or hold spiritual beliefs that need to be considered. And so the aims of this toolkit are to provide an overview of religious diversity and religious discrimination in Canada, just to kind of contextualize what follows from there. To summarize considerations for research design that is inclusive of religiously identified groups, providing high-level descriptions of principles and practices, to suggest questions that researchers can ask themselves to encourage inclusive research design, and offer considerations about the research process, including research ethics, political concerns, and the implications of methodologies and potential impacts on findings, and as well suggest decolonial approaches to research and knowledge production in religious studies that pertain to both the social sciences and humanities. And in the field of religious studies, it's very important that we consider both of the kinds of approaches that scholars use, whether from a humanities point of view or a social science point of view. So we've tried to incorporate that into this toolkit. And so we do start with a bit of an overview on religious diversity in Canada, and to highlight that, we provide some relevant statistical information. And that information helps to build a greater awareness of the salience of religious diversity as we consider its possible impact on research context, design, and practices. So we do provide that in the toolkit. And we also want to highlight the fact that there is diversity within religious traditions so that these groups and categories don't become essentialized. And so people have different orientations towards identifying with and practicing their faith. And it's important to be aware of these varying personal commitments and not make generalized assumptions or stereotype individuals and groups. Some individuals, for example, may identify more culturally with their faith community as opposed to engaging in the religious practices associated with them. So there's a wide range or spectrum of how people approach their faith and their practice of their faith, their identification with it. For example, also Indigenous spiritualities may not be defined as religious by those who adhere to them. However, they represent sacred spiritual traditions that need to be considered in research contexts when working with Indigenous individuals and communities. Indigenous spiritual beliefs and practices also vary significantly among different First Nations, Métis, and Inuit groups and individuals, and can also vary across regions. So really being mindful of the different manifestations of religious and spiritual orientations is important, as well as taking into account things like sectarian differences, ethno-racial hierarchies that exist within various religious communities, issues around, for example, gender discrimination or exclusions around that. Those are all areas that we flag as well to be mindful of in understanding the diversity of religious within religious traditions and some of the challenges there as well. We also highlight the issue of Christian hegemony. Where Canada's heritage of white European settler colonialism has resulted in the prevalence and persistence of Christian privilege in shaping our popular culture and institutional life. And dominant Christian traditions and holidays tend to marginalize those of other faith communities in public life. And those kinds of exclusions permeate civil society and institutions. So it's important to consider how Christian hegemony can create sort of blind spots when it comes to thinking about other faith traditions and how this may impact research design and practices. For example, methodological impacts of Christian hegemony may occur in research contexts if religious holy days and customs are not considered when working with diverse research teams or within religious communities. So these concerns must also be considered with respect to research taking place in domestic as well as international, transnational settings. So some of those kinds of considerations may vary if we take that outside of Canada. So really being mindful of context and geographical context being part of that. And so religious discrimination is also something that we highlight in the toolkit, that along with the prevalence of Christian hegemony, individuals and groups with intersectional identities of race, ethnicity, place of birth, who hold non-Christian beliefs are at risk of being excluded and oppressed by secular policies and practices. Bill 21 in Quebec right now is an example of, a policy that is framed around secularism, but actually is very much a racial project and has its roots in Canada's settler colonial history, and is regulating religious attire in the public sphere. Also religious oppression. So in trying to talk about religious oppression, there's a concept of systemic faithism that is used, and that refers to the ways that cultural and societal norms, systems, structures, and institutions, directly or indirectly, consciously or unwittingly, promote, sustain, or entrench differential advantage for individuals and groups based on their faith, which is understood to broadly include religious and non-religious belief systems. And so it's important to have that understanding of this sort of systemic faithism as we think about working with religiously identified communities. Similarly, religious accommodation is an issue that is salient, and most provinces in Canada include policies in their human rights codes that require duties to accommodate religious observances. The accommodation of religious observances can include practices like the observation of major holy days, prayers or other spiritual practices, funeral practices and rites, dietary requirements or fasting, and dress, including modesty requirements. And, as Vanessa noted at the outset of this presentation, right now we're in the month of Ramadan. And so for a lot of Muslims who are observing Ramadan and who are fasting, there may be specific considerations there to check in on and ask them if they need specific accommodations during Ramadan. There can also be, there's designated times to break fast, so people would need, times to do that, and those times vary throughout the year. So, depending on the time of year Ramadan falls, it could be 5 o'clock or it could be 9 p.m. So in being mindful of the kinds of accommodations that people may need, not just those who you may be working with in the field, but also your research team, your collaborators, and so on. And so just some questions to consider around religious discrimination that are important for researchers to keep on their radar, thinking about the ways that religious exclusion, discrimination, and inequity can inadvertently become reproduced in research settings. So some of the things to consider are, for example, are the needs of religiously marginalized groups and/or research team members being considered and addressed? Are the intersectional aspects of identity and the interlocking forms of oppression connected to them being considered when working with marginalized religious communities or research team members, right? So we'll talk a bit about intersectionality as we move along, but having a sense of those, the ways that identities are configured in those intersectional ways and how those are connected to interlocking oppressions is an important way of thinking about the diverse groups of people we work with. And where relevant, is the diversity of religious experience within faith communities adequately acknowledged? As we mentioned before, that diversity is important. And so considering then, how can research remain free from reproducing religious stereotypes and stigmas? So keeping all of these questions in mind are really important in creating inclusive research design and process. And also, just to elaborate a little bit about religious accommodation, some of the things that can be helpful, as I mentioned, checking in with research team members and/or research participants about the holy days that would need to be considered, planning research tasks, fieldwork, interviews, etc., allowing time and opportunity for the observance of prayers or meditation, and participating in sacred Indigenous traditions such as smudging, drumming, or dance and sweat lodge ceremonies. Ensuring that religious customs are respected so that observant team members and research participants are not placed in situations where they may feel uncomfortable. And that can mean sometimes, depending on the traditions, being around alcohol, being in situations where you are with members of the opposite sex or gender in a private, context, or where there may be physical interaction happening. So being mindful of those, religious observances, and making sure where relevant that food choices consider religious dietary restrictions. So religious accommodation should be part of inclusive research design and methods from the outset, where these needs are identified and/or expected. So rather than, thinking of this later in the game, when you may have already missed opportunities, it's important to have this sort of front of mind as you're developing the design of your study.
Well, now I want to talk a little bit about research design and inclusive research. And Jasmine has already alluded to some of those aspects of inclusive research design when it comes to working with religious communities as part of research. When we thought about research design and this toolkit, we thought about what are those fundamental pieces that are important to consider when it comes to inclusion. And one was obviously this aspect of reflexivity, which is an awareness and examination of the researcher's own biases, beliefs, and perspectives, and how they impact the research process and the research findings. And so reflexivity has often been built into research design or methodologies in a number of different research perspectives, like feminist, anti-racist, Indigenous. And what it really does, it centers on acknowledging power relations that are embedded in the research and the research process, and how these power differentials extend to the relationship between researchers and participants. And so when applying reflexivity to the study of religion, this means that researchers need to be aware of their own religious and/or secular biases, and how that may influence the research process, which includes things like their approach to the research topic or question, the data collection process. For example, are the researchers' own biases impacting how they're collecting data and from whom? Also, the interpretation and representation of findings. For example, how is our researchers' own biases or religious biases and beliefs and perspectives influencing how they're making sense of the data and how they choose to represent their findings? So reflexivity is itself based on a critique of positivistic research that stresses things like objectivity. And reflexivity takes it as a given that researchers will have their own values, biases, and beliefs that will enter into the research process, but it's important to reflect critically on this. And so it's not solely about the awareness of this, but also making sure that we factor in this awareness into the research process so that the research process is more transparent. So for example, someone who is more secular when it comes to doing research with religious groups, I need to reflect and make visible how my identity as a researcher who is secular, is doing research with those who are not, is going to influence the research process. For example, things like whose voices I choose to amplify and whose I don't. How do I code particular data? What labels am I using? And how are those labels shaped by my own beliefs and values and biases? And it's also important to remember this links to the fact that researchers have a certain amount of power relative to participants in the research process, like the power to choose what to share and what not to share. And how do we use that power responsibly and in ways that are inclusive of all voices? Including reflexivity as part of the research design, it can also help increase rigor, credibility, and transparency of the research. It allows the researcher to build in a process in the design of the research to guard against, researchers' own biases. For example, you can build in things like member checking in terms of your findings with participants. And this can also mean including participants in the design of the research questions, even the coding and the analysis of findings. So reflexivity as part of research design means that researchers can create more equitable representative studies that ensure that their biases are identified and addressed, and that religious hegemony or hierarchies and other oppressive structures are not reproduced. If we can move to the next slide, Jasmine. So this idea of intersectionality, Jasmine has alluded to the importance of intersectionality. In terms of research design, we also wanted to highlight this in the toolkit. Like reflexivity, it gives us a way to think about power differences. It highlights different privileges and marginalities that shape an individual's experience. And it starts from the premise that we are more than one identity, but we have multiple social identities, and that these identities overlap and intersect with one another to influence the amount of power and privilege that shapes our social reality. So taking into account intersectionality into the research design when it comes to the study of religion, it recognizes that religious identities overlap and intersect with a multitude of other social markers that will shape people's understanding and experiences of religion. And this goes back to, not looking at the study of religion from an essentialist lens or homogeneous kind of experience. Religion is lived and experienced in a multitude of different ways based on our multiple social identities. So intersectionality pertains not solely to the research participants, but also to researchers or the research team, whereby researchers have multiple and overlapping and intersecting identities and social locations that will shape and influence their views that they bring to the research process and subsequently impact the research. So when it comes to the study of religion and religious institutions, they are set up in ways that privilege particular identities. Those who are often male, literate, able-bodied, middle or upper class, those who occupy those dominant social markers of identity which are valued in society. So subsequently, a research design that uses an intersectional approach brings to light identity-based exclusions when it comes to religion. It enables those marginalized identities within the study of religion and their experiences to be captured when you use an intersectional lens. And it also allows them to be more salient. So for example, religious minorities within and between religious communities, their experiences are brought to light. And it also enables different standpoints on religion and or religious spirituality. So by including or making visible those marginalized religious groups, it allows those power structures and hierarchies that influence religious beliefs and institutions and practices to be examined. Okay, next slide.
So one of the approaches that we thought was important to consider as we look at religion is that of linking it with decolonial thought. And a decolonial approach demands that a review of the dominance of Eurocentric canons and the need to address the legacies of colonial influence on Western academic knowledge production. This is important both for the social sciences and also particularly for humanities approaches to the field of religious studies and looking at religious communities and practices and values and knowledge production within it. So decolonial thought provides valuable insights into how colonial hierarchies persist and suggests ways for decolonizing research methods in religious studies. And so here's some questions that we thought would be important to consider from a decolonial lens. Are academic forms of colonialism being reproduced in the research? Meaning, for example, are non-Western religious cultures being viewed through Western Eurocentric frames of reference? Do marginalized research assistants, for example, have opportunities to publish from the research data or co-publish with dominant scholars on the team? So really being mindful of the ways in which academic colonialism can be reproduced and trying to be mindful of those and dismantle opportunities for that kind of reproduction to take place. Also considering have Indigenous and subaltern religious histories, knowledges, voices, and worldviews been consulted and integrated. So thinking about bringing those subaltern spaces into and voices into a more prominent and central role within the research project and within the development of the ideas that emerge from it. And when looking at research texts, are those religious texts being approached contrapuntally? For example, identifying and making visible the submerged and unacknowledged foundation of colonialism in textual sources, and also considering what the text includes as well as what it excludes. And so, in religious studies, they've been looking a lot at the politics around, for example, citations and what kind of sources are being cited and how that has been very exclusionary historically when it comes to taking into account the knowledge production of women or other marginalized groups. So that is an important consideration when we think about the decolonizing of textual approaches to religious studies. And also considering whether movements like liberation theologies and other subaltern religious resistance movements can be acknowledged within the research. So looking at, the research from those spaces of resistance from subaltern and marginalized and previously colonized communities in terms of their engagement with this field. So those are some considerations from that decolonial perspective and lens on religious research and thought.
We also wanted to look at the process of data collection and analysis, and research design that has an inclusive data collection and analysis process really looks to ensure that your research accurately captures the reality and experiences of all your research participants. And on the slide, you'll see some considerations that as researchers studying religion, we thought were important to think about. So for example, if your research involves racialized and or unrepresented religious communities, who benefits from the research findings? And so, if you take the example of when studying religious minorities who have been surveilled by the state, these communities have found ways to resist state surveillance. So we have to ask how these religious minorities will benefit from those strategies being shared as part of the findings, particularly if the state becomes aware of these strategies. So it goes back to thinking about the unintended consequences or impacts, both positive and negative, on marginalized religious communities or marginalized groups within religious communities due to the research design in terms of data collection and analysis and sharing those findings. Are your research questions reflective of the needs and or experiences of the communities you're engaged with. So oftentimes, research questions, research design is put together before researchers enter into the field. And oftentimes the questions that are asked, the data that is collected is not really reflective of the needs of the community. And so as part of inclusive research design, you have to sort of ask yourself, is there room? Where is there room to collaborate with those, research populations that you are working with, particularly in religious communities? Where are those spaces for collaboration throughout the research process, which includes the questions, the research methods that are being used, what data is being collected, how is that data being coded, what labels are used, how do communities feel about those particular labels that are being used to code research data when using qualitative methods. And so in religious communities, we know that there are differences in terms of religious beliefs, religious ideologies, religious practices based on different social identities. And so when doing the data collection and data analysis, how collaborative is your process in terms of, theorizing, or in terms of making sense of that data, or even thinking about, the findings that are going to be shared. And this is where you can build into your research design different practices like member checking, even as you're doing your coding, your analysis, to go back to communities that you are working with and asking them for their perspective on your analysis or the codes that you're using. Because it's much easier and much better to do this than doing it after the fact, after you've shared your findings. And then you find out that community members are actually not happy with how you've actually coded something or how you've made sense of that data. And that creates a lot of mistrust in terms of research communities, and makes it even more difficult to work with communities when it comes to research. So think about those unintended impacts, positive or negative, that may occur and impact marginalized religious communities when you're planning your research design. And also thinking about also that intersectional and comparative perspectives when you're designing your research. Are you collecting data from, a spectrum of people within the community, a religious community that you're working with? Is that intersectional analysis reflective of that spectrum of participants, and so on? So these are just some of the things that you may want to think about when you're thinking about things like data collection and analysis. Next slide. Research ethics and protocols. This is always part of research. And as noted in the toolkit, research ethics is crucial in the study of religion because it helps ensure that research is conducted in a responsible and respectful manner that protects the rights and dignity of religious individuals and communities, and also ensures the reliability and validity of research findings. Research usually has had to adhere to basic ethical principles like informed consent, confidentiality, privacy, standards around minimal risk and harm. And these standards are usually set out in Canada according to the TCPS2, the Tri-Council Policy Statement for Research. And most institutions abide by the all institutions doing research in Canada have to abide by the TCPS2. However, what do these standards look like when you're conducting research in the area of religion? And so on the slide, you'll see some considerations. So for example, when upholding these ethical principles, you have to think about, when working with religious communities, respect for beliefs. So researchers have to respect the beliefs and practices of the religious groups that are being studied and avoid offending or offending members of that group. Being aware of biases and cultural sensitivity. So researchers need to be aware of their own biases, and this goes back also to reflexivity. and strive to be culturally sensitive in your research methods and your interpretations of your findings or your data. Then there's power dynamics. So when studying religious groups, researchers have to be aware of the power dynamics that exist between themselves and participants, and also within communities, and have to avoid sort of exploiting your power as a researcher in terms of the research process. And then protection of vulnerable populations. So researchers have to take extra care to make sure that they protect the rights and the welfare of vulnerable populations, such as religious minorities and those who may be subject to discrimination or abuse. And so this is sort of just the basic ethical standards. Obviously, they're a lot more nuanced and complex as you look at the context of the religious or spiritual community that you're working with. These research ethical protocols are going to maybe look somewhat different than the standards of the TCPS2, and think about, how do I meet those TCPS2 standards within the context of particular religious communities and groups who may have their own ideas around ethics and research ethics and protocols. Next slide.
So just to delve a little bit more into some of the considerations around research ethics and protocol, we're just going to flag a couple of areas that we do outline and elaborate more in the toolkit. The first is the risk and securitization of research. And this is an issue that I have personally experienced in my own research, looking at Muslim communities in Canada in a post 9/11 context. And in particular, my recent book was an ethnographic study of what I call the 9/11 generation of Muslim youth, who were growing up at a time where, the global geopolitics and domestic security concerns were shaping and informing and at times threatening the research context. And so I had to be very considerate of the kinds of issues that this raised for me as a researcher working with vulnerable youth who were already being labeled by security communities as potential radicals and so on. And so, this was something that other researchers as well who are conducting qualitative ethnographic research among Muslim communities in the post 9/11 context raised concerns about, and about the securitization that was happening, to the research. So, for example, it would not be uncommon to be contacted by security agencies because they have become aware that you're researching this population and want to ask you questions. And that, for me, raised all sorts of issues around protecting the data, protecting the participants. We already, look at things of like maintaining anonymity and using pseudonyms and so on, but we had to go an extra distance of making sure anything that was on our computers only reflected pseudonyms. Real names were, paper-based, and having those kept and scattered among research assistants and things so that they were not all in one place, because we didn't know if that information could be confiscated by security agencies. So there was a whole other way of thinking about even our ability to provide the kind of anonymity and protection of that data that we, are required to do. And it also led to other kinds of concerns in terms of, for example, garnering trust in communities that have been under surveillance and may question researchers' motives, taking extra precautions to preserve confidentiality and anonymity of research participants, as I mentioned, and carefully considering how the research findings cannot be used to harm them, particularly in a context and climate of heightened securitization. And so those are some of the things we elaborate a bit more in the toolkit, but are probably some issues that aren't often considered by researchers when they're embarking on this kind of study with vulnerable communities that may become securitized. And so we thought that was important to for us to consider in this toolkit and provide some caution around.
There's then the aspect of informed consent. And there is often a dominant informed consent research protocol that's used when it comes to research. For example, consent is often seen between individuals. It's usually written and so on. So, this has been the dominant sort of institutional research ethics protocol when it comes to informed consent. But when it comes to religious, ethnic, and indigenous cultures, there can be different understandings and interpretations of consent, which is also reflective of different consent practices and protocols. For example, in some cultures, like indigenous cultures, there's a value on things like communitarianism rather than on the individual. So consent is not determined by the individual participant, but by the community. Or also consent doesn't necessarily just include living beings, but it can include things like ancestors or non-human entities, like spirits or the natural world. And therefore, consent must include these aspects, and that there are religious and cultural practices associated with securing this consent that may sometimes conflict with institutional consent practices. So to ensure community requirements are actually met, it's important to have or build flexibility into your research project or your research design that allows time for collaboration between the researchers and the communities in which the religious or spiritual or indigenous communities that they're working with. So building in that flexibility and that time into the research process to be able to find out what informed consent looks like. What are those protocols? What are those practices? What are those things that have to be met as part of informed consent when working with these communities? And that also helps to build trust in the research process, so that as you do move along within the research process, that you have that trust at the very beginning, and making sure that that it is sustained. And so, this sometimes becomes somewhat difficult to negotiate between institutions. There are examples where in spiritual communities, when they are non-living entities that are important to communities, religious and spiritual communities, where it comes to consent, where institutional ethics protocols have not really factored in how to deal with those aspects. And so it's often comes on the part of researchers and research teams to sort of be innovative and work with communities, these religious and spiritual communities, to find ways to make sure that those informed consent protocols that are important to these communities are actually honored. Jasmine?
So a lot of the times research will also take us into sacred spaces. So there's some considerations there that are also important, where research protocols call for field work in sacred spaces such as temples, mosques, jamaat-khanas, synagogues, gurdwaras, churches, indigenous ceremonies, and so on. So there's important points to consider in navigating these sites respectfully. And it's also important to learn ahead of time what are the appropriate ways to enter and inhabit sacred spaces. So, for example, some sites might require removing shoes, wearing head coverings or modest attire, navigating within gender segregated spaces, all practices that need to be respected by visitors. So speaking to religious or community leaders in advance of these kinds of visits to ask about what kind of etiquette visitors should follow is a good starting point when you are thinking about taking your research into sacred spaces. And, that also involves being mindful of things like designated prayer times, special services, funerals, and religious holidays. And those are important things to plan a visit around. And also, once you're in that space, when prayers or other rituals are taking place, to be mindful not to let the congregants there feel as though they're in a fishbowl, and avoid while you may be observing, taking photos or things like that turn those sacred experiences into a spectacle, which is not what you want to have happen.
There's then also the aspect of etiquette and reciprocity. Reciprocity is an ethical standard that research participants and communities, including religious communities, should be seen as something where the researchers, like, oftentimes reciprocity is built into the ethical protocol piece, because researchers have often just gone in and seen research sites as places of extraction, simply going in, extracting information, leaving those communities. And oftentimes those communities have not benefited from the research process. So hence the importance of reciprocity. And so when looking at this idea of reciprocity and it being a more equal partnership or relationship between researchers and participants, when looking at it from a perspective of working with religious and spiritual communities, you have to be cognizant of the cultural and religious norms that are part of that community and that religious or spiritual community. And this helps researchers when it comes to following the proper etiquette and reciprocity protocols. If you understand those communities, if you talk with the people in the communities about what is important, what is considered to be important in terms of building those relationships based on reciprocity. So the cultural context for reciprocal exchanges is important to understand, and to do so before embarking on the research, because you don't want to violate those norms or those practices. So being aware of them ahead of time is really important. There are examples in the toolkit where it talks about we often use as researchers our own ideas and values and biases about what we feel to be important, and we impose them on the communities that we are working with, with good intentions, thinking that, oh, okay, well, I value money, so the communities that I'm working with must also value money, and so therefore this is a appropriate form to be used for reciprocity, which we know is not always the case. In times, times religious and, spiritual and other communities can see money or the things that we value as being offensive. And so things like individually paying a participant may not be appropriate. Instead, it could mean making a donation to a temple or a gurdwara or synagogue or something of that nature. So understanding that cultural and religious context and those norms and what's appropriate or not helps in terms of not violating those norms, and also in further building trust with those communities.
And finally, the issue of positionality is really important to consider, and that kind of takes us back to some of the considerations that we talked about earlier around reflexivity as well. So when you're considering conducting research on or with religious communities that you're not a member of, there are important issues to address before you embark on that journey. And that's also because of the histories of outsider research among racially and religiously marginalized groups that are often rooted in colonial encounters and histories. And those experiences have meant that knowledge production about marginalized religious groups has taken place through the prism of subordinating power relations. And so through these discursive practices, racially marked faith communities have often been relegated to subaltern roles. And we need to be mindful of our own positionalities in not reproducing those kinds of power dynamics, being mindful of how those encounters have been shaped by particular histories. And often those are colonial histories or histories that are rooted in the racial formations of the state. And so we need to be aware of our own bodies. The role of our body within knowledge production is very, very important. And a lot of that can also mean that some of us at times can be insiders and outsiders simultaneously when conducting research. So for example, I've been doing research predominantly on Muslim communities, and I am a Muslim. And so there are ways that I am an insider in the community, but I also carry institutional ties to my university, and that puts me in a place of having a different set of power relations with the participants in my study. So I can both be insider and outsider, and because religious communities are diverse, I represent, being part of a more dominant group in terms of my sectarian identification. So I can be working with other community sectors of the community that are more marginalized. And so there's still always going to be ways, even if you are a member of that community, that you can occupy that space of insider, outsider. And all of that requires that sense of reflexive thought and action.
So we just want to leave you with sort of a concluding thought. The field of religious study is extensive, and it encompasses a variety of research methodologies, making a one-size-fits-all approach impossible. And nonetheless, researchers looking for advice on adopting a more inclusive approach to their research design are left with few resources to guide them. And the toolkit provides a preliminary roadmap for researchers who want to transform the way they think about and conduct research projects in ways that better reflect religious and cultural diversity from an integrative and intersectional lens that focused on producing more equitable scholarship. And I think all that we've sort of summed up today is really about, this toolkit. When we first started out putting it together, we realized that there wasn't really a lot out there. There wasn't a roadmap. There's been lots of studies, been lots of work that is done in the area of religion when it comes to research, but there was no comprehensive sort of roadmap that really talked about things like research design, ethics, and so on. And so we really feel that this toolkit is a really good starting place for those of researchers who are embarking on doing studies with religious and spiritual communities, to really sort of dip their toe in and get a sense of, some of the pieces that are really important to consider when working with religious communities. So we'll leave it there.